committee to order today. I'm Yvonne Bailey, the chairman. We have a new member, Jenny, but I can't read your last name. Kelvington. So welcome, Jenny, to our committee. Under General Statute 138-15, it mandates that the chairman inquire as to whether any member knows of any known conflict of interest or appearance of conflict with respect to matters before the commission. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of a conflict, please so state at this time. Does anyone know of a conflict? Good. Then we'll move on to approval of the minutes from the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee meeting on September 8, 2021. Have you had a chance to review it? Are there any comments about the minutes? Do I have a motion to approve?
Move to approve the minutes.
Commissioner Arata made the motion. Do I have a second?
Second, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Keene. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any nays? Minutes are passed. We're moving on to an informational item that Jenny Patterson will be presenting to us. It's adding solar panels as a universal waste.
Thank you, Chairman Bailey. May I remove my mask?
Yes,
okay,
that's fine. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Bailey, and good morning, everyone. My name is Jenny Patterson, and I work with the Division of Waste Management in the Hazardous Waste section. And it is wonderful to be here today with you all in person and provide information on adding solar panels as a universal waste. I'll be happy to take any questions during the presentation or at the end, whichever your preference. So this proposed rulemaking concept was developed as a result of House Bill 329, the evaluation from House Bill 329 of the end-of-life management of renewable energy equipment. The proposed rulemaking was noted as a recommendation in the final report, and that final report was provided to you all as attachment F. This proposed rulemaking concept, however, extends beyond the scope of utility scale solar projects and would apply to all non-residential solar panels. There's already a regulatory program in place for end-of-life solar panels that are a hazardous waste, so this proposed rulemaking provides an alternative management option. Making end-of-life solar panels a universal waste is anticipated to increase the recycling options for solar panels that would be designated as a hazardous waste if they were disposed. This slide has a diagram that shows the relationship between hazardous waste and universal waste. Universal waste categories must be a hazardous waste before they can be considered a universal waste. So universal wastes are exempt from full hazardous waste regulation, but they still must be managed separately from general trash. This diagram also indicates that a hazardous waste is a subset of solid waste. And for purposes of this presentation, we're going to call the solid waste portion of the diagram non-hazardous waste. So these are the wastes that can typically be disposed of in a Subtitle D landfill. Many of the solar panels, especially the newer ones, will fall into this non-hazardous waste portion of the diagram, but there still are some that will be a hazardous waste when they are at the end of their life. There are currently 5 categories of items that are considered as universal waste, both on the federal level and in North Carolina. These 5 categories are lamps, batteries, mercury-containing equipment, pesticides, and aerosol cans. North Carolina has adopted, through incorporation by reference, the federal regulations, and we didn't have any amendments or additions. So North Carolina doesn't have any additional state universal waste categories at this time. Many other states do have state universal wastes. For example, that go beyond the federal scope. So for example, Texas has added paint waste as a state universal waste, among other items. California and Hawaii has added both solar panels and electronics as a state universal waste. Because this presentation is posted on the website and is public information, I wanted to very clearly state to anyone seeing the slides without the context of this presentation that currently solar panels are not considered a universal waste in North Carolina. And as you know, we would have to go through a rulemaking process with the commission in order to have them be added as a universal waste. So one of the most frequent questions we've been getting about solar panels as a universal waste is if a site has determined that there are non-hazardous waste solar panels, would they still have to be managed as a universal waste? So if North Carolina adopted rules making solar panels a universal waste, any solar panel determined to be non-hazardous or that was from a household would only need to meet the North Carolina solid waste requirements. So non-hazardous waste solar panels or ones from households would not be required to be managed as a hazardous waste or a universal waste in North Carolina. Universal waste requirements apply to solar panels that are a hazardous waste or if a site opts to not test them to determine whether they're non-hazardous. So attachment B is a flow chart that theoretically lays out the waste determination process for solar panels. And at the end of this presentation, I've added some of those flow chart slides. If you wanted to dive into it a little further, we could explore the waste determination process. It also explains where the universal waste rules would come into play in that waste determination. With new rules, terminology would have to be developed to define these units. Here's an overview of the proposed terminology that we would like to use. So photovoltaic cells in series make up a solar panel. A solar array or solar panels in series, and a solar voltaic system or solar panels in series with the ancillary equipment like the inverters, wiring, batteries, connectors, junction boxes. So we do have very specific definitions for these items. So the next 3 slides are the specific definitions. So here's the definition for solar panel. Solar panels are often referred to by a couple of different names, photovoltaic modules or photovoltaic panels. The definition for solar panel will include only the integrated portion of the solar panel and does not include solar thermal panels that do not contain photovoltaic cells. This slide provides the definition for a photovoltaic cell, since it makes up solar panels. Photovoltaic cells are commonly referred to as solar cells. The definition includes a wide variety of possible compositions for these items. And because new solar panels are being developed and photovoltaic cells have different compositions, it's not going to limit the cell to being a certain composition. So it leaves the definition a little open if something is developed along the way. And here is the definition for solar voltaic system. Since the definition of solar panel focused only on the integrated portion of the solar panel, any of the ancillary equipment of the solar voltaic cell, like the metal frame, the battery, the inverters, the wiring, that can be removed without breaking the solar panel, can be removed and managed separately from the solar panel. So the definitions were developed to try to encourage recycling, because a lot of those non-integrated portions of the solar panel have a very high likelihood of being recycled. And so here's a visual example of the components of the solar panel that are typically considered to be integrated. When a site is making a waste determination on a solar panel, any of the components that are able to be detached from that solar panel without breaking the solar panel could be managed separately. So many of the non-integrated components like frames and wiring are metal, and they have a really, they're often easily recycled. Batteries already are considered a universal waste, or they could be managed under the lead acid battery requirements if they were regenerated. There are many benefits to managing solar panels as a universal waste. Attachment C lists some of those, briefly lists some of those pros and cons for managing solar panels as a universal waste. Some of the benefits are that the requirements for management on site are reduced. So chances are it's going to increase the compliance with requirements. It also offers an opportunity for those solar panels to be recycled. So one of the downsides of managing solar panels as a universal waste is the designation only applies to states that have adopted rules, making it a universal waste. So if the end-of-life solar panel leaves North Carolina, it loses the universal waste designation. There are not a lot of recycling facilities in North Carolina yet who can recycle a universal waste solar panel. So at this point, that's one of the downsides if it had to go out of state for recycling. One of the upsides is with this rule, more recycling opportunities might open up. So something back up. One of the benefits, as mentioned on this slide, is that a site has an option that they wouldn't have to test the solar panel to see if it's a hazardous waste. And I mentioned that because on this next slide, it provides further explanation on that. So the previous slide mentioned that testing would not be required to manage a solar panel as a universal waste. This is because an assumption can be made by the generator that the solar panel is a hazardous waste. So one can opt to not test the solar panel and just manage it more conservatively as a hazardous waste or a universal waste if North Carolina adopted those requirements. So the benefit here is if someone didn't want to spend money on testing, to show it's not hazardous, they could just opt to say, okay, I'm gonna manage it as a universal waste. And again, if the material's been shown to be non-hazardous or excluded from regulation, that the hazardous waste or universal waste rules wouldn't apply. The material would just be a solid waste. These proposed rules will not apply to solar panels that are not yet a waste. The solar panel that can be legitimately used for its intended purpose would not fall under the Division of Waste Management regulatory jurisdiction. Also, if the solar panel is a hazardous waste, if the solar panel is not a hazardous waste, these rules also would not apply. And that's something I'm trying to reiterate throughout this presentation. There are many entities that many universal waste entities that will be managing solar panels if they were made a universal waste. Each entity has their own requirements as far as management. The requirements for solar panels would look similar to the existing requirements for other universal waste categories. There are two types of universal waste handlers, and this is typically with the solar sites. The sites where the solar panels are determined to be a waste would be universal waste handlers. A small quantity handler of universal waste generates, collects, or accumulates 5,000 kilograms total on site of universal waste at any time. And a large quantity handler of universal waste collects, generates, or accumulates 5,000 kilograms or more of universal waste at any time. Neither of these handlers can treat or dispose of universal waste, except for very specific allowances that are described in the rules. If a site was managing batteries as universal waste, they would also need to count that into that threshold amount, 5,000 kilograms. This slide provides some side-by-side comparison of the general universal waste requirements for both the small and the large quantity handlers of universal waste. The difference is that a large quantity handler has a few more requirements. They need to notify the hazardous waste section and get an EPA ID number for the activity. They also have some more comprehensive training and then also have to maintain some shipping records, but they don't have to maintain a hazardous waste manifest. They typically would maintain a bill of lading. So attachment D and E provided some side-by-side comparisons. Attachment D had comparisons between management of non-hazardous waste, hazardous waste, and universal waste. And then attachment E had more detailed side-by-side comparison of hazardous waste and universal waste, just to see how the requirements are a little less stringent. So if solar panels were made of universal waste, they must be managed in a way that prevents breakage and release of the universal waste or any universal waste components to the environment. This is a common theme for all universal waste. If universal waste or universal waste components are released to the environment and not immediately cleaned up, this waste would revert back to being a hazardous waste. And if it was disposed of on a site, that could be disposal of a hazardous waste, would be subject to permit requirements. So solar panels must be accumulated in a container or other method, something like shrink wrapping them on a pallet. It must prevent breakage, spillage, leakage, or damage that would cause leakage under reasonable foreseeable conditions. And then we're proposing that any intact solar panels wouldn't need to actually be contained themselves. They just need to show that they're fully intact and not leaking or broken. And as mentioned previously, there's a maximum of 1 year on-site accumulation. And this provides a lot more time than the hazardous waste rules. Hazardous waste has typically 180 days to 90 days, depending on the amount of hazardous waste that's being generated at a site. And a lot of these larger sites would be large quantity generators, so the maximum amount of time on site would be 90 days. There would be a requirement to clean up any solar panels that showed evidence of leakage, spillage, or damage. Again, it's to the best interest of the site, because if it's not immediately cleaned up, it becomes subject to the hazardous waste rules. And there are some labeling requirements that also go along with, and this falls in line with other universal waste requirements. Universal waste handlers are prohibited from treatment and disposal of universal waste, except for the 3 specific activities that are described in the regulations. The removal of ancillary components that are typically removed for placement during normal operation and maintenance of the solar voltaic system, like, for example, connectors, junction boxes, batteries, inverters, would not be considered treatment and would be allowed. So it would be another allowable activity. The universal waste handler should conduct the activity, the removal of the ancillary components, in a manner that's prescribed in the operating manual for the solar voltaic system, or in a manner that would otherwise be reasonably employed during the normal operation and maintenance of that solar photovoltaic system. Handlers of universal waste are limited on where they can send universal waste. So universal waste handlers must send universal waste only to other universal waste handlers, to a destination facility, and that's very specifically defined, and I'll tell you about that on future slide, and or could send it to a foreign destination. If a solar panels were added as a universal waste in North Carolina, they could only be managed as a universal waste in North Carolina, so they would have to go to a destination facility in North Carolina unless it was a permitted treatment, storage, and disposal facility. So the opportunity to send them to a recycling facility outside of North Carolina or to a foreign destination are limiting with this requirement of a state universal waste. Universal waste transporters have specific requirements that they also must follow, but very briefly, they need to follow the DOT requirements. If any universal waste transporter holds universal waste for more than 10 days, they need to meet the generator requirements that were mentioned on previous slides. So it's very easy for transportation of universal waste. But a note about transporting universal waste, something important to consider is even though it makes it easier to transport it in North Carolina, if universal waste solar panels are shipped outside of North Carolina to a state or even through a state that hasn't adopted the regulations, the universal waste can still be managed as a universal waste in North Carolina, but once it hits the state line, it's got to be managed as a hazardous waste or by the state requirements of the state, the receiving state or the state that it's traveling through. And finally, universal waste destination facilities. These are sites that are either a permitted hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facility or a facility that recycles a particular universal waste. In this case, it could be one that recycles solar panels, but there are specific requirements that apply. They would have to be able to initiate that recycling operation within 24 hours of receiving it. They have to receive waste on a manifest and comply with certain air emission requirements, and reporting requirements would also apply to them. So the next steps, we would like to return to the Division of Waste Management would like to return to the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee in January, March 2022 to request approval to go to the EMC with proposed amendments to the hazardous waste management rules to add solar panels as a universal waste. So at that time, we also plan to make some other clarifying updates to the hazardous waste requirements, but this is what we plan as our next step. So I can take questions. I also have those additional slides at the end of this presentation if anyone would like to see the waste determination process.
Thank you. That was an excellent presentation. I'm trying to get the big picture out of this. So the panels that are right now needing to be disposed of, unless they want to go through the whole hazardous waste testing procedure, are the panels being dismantled and recycled, and then other parts are going to the solid waste landfill right now? Like, what's happening right now?
That's an excellent question. So right now, because a lot of the large scale utility solar projects haven't been decommissioned yet, we're not exactly sure what's happening to the smaller volumes of solar panels. A lot of them are coming from households and they can enjoy household hazardous waste exclusion. They wouldn't have to be managed as a hazardous waste under our regulations. They could be managed as a solid waste. Solar panels from businesses, on the other hand, they are already subject to having to make a waste determination on any waste that's generated at their site. So theoretically, what should be happening is that any site that's generating an end-of-life solar panel that can't be refurbished or reused for its intended purpose as is, would be making a waste determination to determine whether it's a hazardous or solid waste, non-hazardous waste, and managing it accordingly.
Okay, so they're having to go through the whole hazardous waste testing procedure, all the loops they have to go through.
Yeah, so with this, the big picture for this is it gives them another avenue that if they ended up having a hazardous waste, it gives them something that makes it a little easier to manage, because it's a lot of times the hazardous waste rules were really intended for large scale industrial waste, vats of chemicals. So when it comes to applying those same rules to a solar panel, sometimes it's just a reevaluation of trying to apply existing rules to help with the proper management.
So like, so the hazardous waste management facility that would be the closest one where these things could be disposed of, wouldn't that be South Carolina?
So there are, in North Carolina, there are 9 permitted treatment, storage, and disposal facilities that could initially accept them as a hazardous waste. As far as them being a universal waste, the opportunity, I don't know of any sites that currently meet the requirements of having notified us and able to recycle these within 24 hours and meeting the reporting requirements yet, but it's an opportunity for them.
So there's 9 hazardous waste facilities in the site that could take it I mean,
As a
it sounds-
hazard, as a
as a
hazardous
hazardous
waste.
waste. So it's like when they do this whole, they're gonna store it, you know, if it becomes a universal waste, then they don't have to go through the whole manifest system. And then they're storing it, they're bringing it to what the distribution, the handlers, and then it goes to the transport, and then it's gonna go to the hazardous waste facility within the state boundaries. There's enough to handle it.
Theoretically, so the sites themselves would be the handlers. So the site with the solar panel would be the initial handler, and then it could go to a warehouse or to another handler of universal waste. So that's the beauty of this is as long as they're meeting the requirements, the site that generates the
The
solar
solar
panel,
panels.
at the end of life solar panel, and they're like, this is a waste, we need to figure out what to do with it. They could manage it at their site, they could manage it at a distribution center or a warehouse. As long as it was in North Carolina, they've got some flexibility and options. So really what this rule does is help with that on-site management or allows them to get it to another site. It also eases the burden of the transportation.
Oh, okay, because this, under this rule, they get a year, whereas hazardous waste is 180 days, so they'd have to move this quickly or quicker. And that's part of the advantage to them. They can store it on site in a good container.
Correct. And with hazardous waste rules, not only is there a limit on the time, but it has to be managed on site and then there's no option to take it to an intermediate handler. It would have to go directly to that permitted treatment, storage, and disposal facility.
Okay. I know you have additional slides, but does anybody else on the committee have any questions? Commissioner Lazar?
Yes, and also that was very helpful. I was curious about the distinction between panels that are intact and the requirements for those versus ones that aren't, whether it's for storage or transport or whatever. There was one slide that said if they're intact, they're not considered hazardous. And then I was just wondering if that's the case, does that discourage recycling of components given all the different components that could be taken apart? Or is there any kind of, or a plan to build in sort of requirements for maximizing recycling of any components that can be reused?
I think the distinction was, and I apologize because you were correct, that the requirement to contain them, if this panel was intact itself without being broken, that it wouldn't have to go into another container. But as far as the panel itself, all of the non-integrated portions of the panel could be removed, and then the panel itself would be managed as the universal waste. So as long as the hazard, they say the hazard comes from when that panel is broken, and then the metals that are within that solar panel would pose the hazard of leaching out into the environment. So managing the panel itself and removing as much of the non-integrated portions without breaking the panel would be allowed. And then that's the limit of what the handler could do. The transporter could also manage the intact panels. And then once it gets to that recycling facility, they're allowed to break it and do further treatment. So once they get into the operations of doing anything that makes the panel, the integrity of the panel is broken, that would be considered treatment to us. So the intentional breakage of that panel would be treatment. The unintentional breakage that happens all the time, they would have to containerize it. So they could still manage it as a universal waste. They would just put it in a container and clean up any residual from that panel immediately. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did, and particularly the distinction between non-integrated components. But I'm still curious in the the picture of the level of layers, like the glass and all that, and top of the photovoltaic cells. That one, like, are any of those other parts potentially recyclable once it's actually broken down?
Yes.
That would be ideal, that we could really reuse as many parts and get, and only isolate the actual hazardous part. But-
Yeah, there's some maintenance that they can do, but really for the most part, once they start breaking into this and doing work on the panel itself, that's stuff that they typically wouldn't be doing on site. They would have to remove it and do some work off site. But if they are doing routine maintenance or changing out certain parts or equipment, that would be allowed. But yeah, so there are various levels of recyclable materials within that solar panel. So the metals are pretty easily for them to recycle. So that's what a recycling facility would do, is break it down into the components of high value and low value. And right now in North Carolina, unfortunately, we don't have any sites that do high value recycling for this type of material to extract the metals and stuff.
Are there any other questions?
Yes. Madam Chair, I don't know if this falls under the preview of what we were discussing. Just a thought of site preparation, site permitting for those that are being used now, and the time that their lease will run out, especially large pieces, acreage. So during this study, was there site permitting permits for soil, for breakage of units into the soil? I guess that would affect groundwater in some cases, I guess in some sites. And I know we're talking about recyclable, these components. But if a site is established and permitted, then wouldn't it be a positive piece of this going forward to give some indication of is it contaminating the soil through flooding or breakage? And would they be allowed to possibly just their lease run out and move on, and it have to be back to where it was? But then if they wanted to refit and stay, probably not have to have vaccinations to stay, but no pun intended. But the idea of recycling this is one thing, but have you considered the soil piece?
So if there were broken component, indirectly, I would say maybe not directly, because when these, I'm going to use solar, utility scale solar projects as an example, when they go in, those aren't a waste. So it's hard for our regulations to apply. Our jurisdiction as far as the hazardous waste, or the Division of Waste Management, really starts to fall under our regulatory jurisdiction at the point when those solar panels are taken out of service and no longer used for their intended purpose, or they're abandoned. So in that aspect, if they were abandoned and determined to be a hazardous waste, if they would fall into the hazardous waste realm, then it would be subject to it could be considered disposal if it did release into the environment. So indirectly, there is an avenue to address that.
Could I ask you a question? I mean, what I think he raises a good point about who permits it in the first place, because we're not, DEQ isn't permitting it. We deal with waste and disposal. So he's saying, well, somebody's got a permit. Does the permit, who's issuing that permit, and are there conditions in the permit about how these things are handled? And then, depending on when they become a waste, then it comes over to us. So do you know who permits it right now?
I might need to ask for some support from our Division of Waste Management director or deputy director, but my understanding is that, is it the Utility Commission?
That's what I was
That's-
thinking, but I don't know.
It's my understanding I could get some more information for you as far as front end permitting. I could
Well, I
provide.
have-
And Director Scott is coming up.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I could, this originally started a few years back with counties trying to find comprehensive land use plans for and increase in revenues, property, tax issues, this several years ago. And this was one of the points that was brought up at that time is what happens at the end of the lease period, whether it be 20 years or 30 years or 10 years, or what happens in between if a company goes bankrupt and then those panels are just sitting there, what do we do with those? So that was sort of the original thought here 3, 4, 5 years ago. I was a part of that. And this is where we are today. So when we're going into this particular piece of legislation or policy that sets it up, then if we're talking about waste handlers and breakage of units and having to be wrapped and stored, if they're doing it on site or off site, if it's under the preview of the rules that we're establishing, then, and we're groundwater as well as waste management, then it falls under the soil and the ground. And is it contaminating the site? And then when it's over with, it's just not what it's above ground that you can see in the panels. It's also in the dirt, in the soil. And is that being mixed up with this policy moving forward? That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, I see what you mean, and I'm wondering, that's where I'm going with who's issuing the original permit and does it have monitoring and conditions in the permit, like most of our permits have, with monitoring whether or not there's leaks. So if you can give us sort of a brief answer on that, because then once there is kind of a leak, it probably comes over to us. But I'd just like to know what you have to say about that.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Michael Scott, Director of the Division of Waste Management. Welcome, new members. Appreciate the opportunity for us to start this discussion with you on solar and the possibility of universal waste designation. A couple of quick points. The report came to the Environmental Management Commission from DEQ in January regarding the legislation that required the evaluation of solar decommissioning. And that's really the conversation, Commissioner Keene and Chair Bailey are having right now. Jenny's touching on a piece of that, meaning the panel itself and what are the possibilities of it being a universal waste and what that offers to our state when these sites have to be decommissioned. As some of you may remember in that report, we clearly indicated most of these solar farms are 8 to 10 years out before they will need to be decommissioned. Some of them may be able to be repowered, repurposed at that time, but we're still several years out before that will occur. There have been instances, I believe Tennessee is an example, where there was a tornado event or extreme storm event where some panels had to be managed, but because of an extreme weather event. So our specific group, DEQ, is not issuing a permit for these solar farms. We're speaking to you today on the back end or the management of the material, if it is a waste or a recyclable material that needs to be managed. Ultimately, there's coordination with the Utilities Commission. A lot of that's dependent on the size and scale, the 1 megawatt threshold, or how big, if you will, these facilities are. What I will also say is there's also a lot of local government requirements that you'll find around the state for the counties that really have seen a lot of solar growth within them. So when we presented the report to the commission in January, the joint report between the department and the commission, decommissioning was a big piece of that. And what I will say is we're still working on those components. I have been in conversations with Commissioner Keene about soil testing or what needs to be done regarding that in the future. We're not currently collecting that information as the Division of Waste Management, DEQ, but it is an integrated approach, not just from the panel being recycled or managed as a universal waste, as Jenny indicated, but all the way down to the platform, the infrastructure, and the other components if that needed to be returned to a greenfield site. I think that's what you're asking. If it's not going to be repowered, what are going to be the requirements to do that? The short answer is, our group, we don't have a permit covering that at this time, but there are local government requirements and zoning approvals that address some of those pieces, including a topic that we continue to discuss. There's actually going to be an additional legislative report, I believe it's due in March, regarding the financial assurance requirements, if there needs to be discussion of those at whatever level, whether it's in state government or utilities commission, that would cover the decommissioning of panels, and is that needed and everything that encompasses it. So in summary, there's a lot of coordination with the Utilities Commission. Our group does not issue specific permits for these sites, and we're still working towards what complete and comprehensive decommissioning looks like. But this is an important component of it, meaning the actual solar cells themselves. Hope that helps.
Thank you. I had a couple of questions about that. So you made it clear that the Utilities Commission is issuing the permit, and it sounds like they probably don't have financial responsibility requirements in their permits, or do you know?
So the report, and I know the Chair Smith may want to chime in here, or you maybe want to chime in if I saw you correctly, but the financial assurance piece was part of the report that we submitted to the Commission in January. The conclusion of DEQ was that at this time, panels are not going to need to be decommissioned for 8 to 10 years. There's still some time to evaluate this process of financial assurance for that requirement. What I then noted was there's an additional legislative required report that I think is due in March regarding the further exploration of financial assurance. There is already financial assurance requirements at the local government level in certain counties. But what was asked of DEQ in order to provide to this commission and body was, did there need to be a statewide requirement? And in that January report, we said, not at this time, knowing that we're still a few years out from full decommissioning, but we will further evaluate it. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. And Chair Smith?
I was just going to add to that it may be helpful to have a little bit more information brought to the committee and the commission about the division of labor on approval of these types of projects. My understanding is that the Utilities Commission does not exactly issue a permit. What they issue, if it's utility grade project, they have to issue a certificate of convenience and necessity. So confirming that it's a project that's necessary under their criteria, but they don't do site plan reviews, and largely that's been exclusively a local government function. There's not a state agency that comprehensively reviews and approves site plans for solar, utility grade solar farms.
Oh, okay, so there is a gap there.
Well, I think in the report, if I could comment on that piece, and I think that's a great idea. We could bring some of our colleagues from the energy team in DEQ. It's more than just Jenny and I and Julie, our deputy director, but bring our energy group to speak to that total picture. When we do go back to that report in January that was submitted to this body, the commission, it does touch on some of those pieces, the local government aspects. We tried to address the gap that you just mentioned, Chair Bailey, that our existing rules and statutes speak to the management of solid waste, speak to the management of hazardous waste that Jenny's touching on. And we addressed directly, we didn't recommend at the time a full regulatory program be stood up. We have groundwater requirements, as you very well know, in North Carolina. We have surface water requirements, and the existing regulatory infrastructure we really felt was sufficient in that report to deal with this waste stream as it comes about. Like I said, the industry continues to grow. We're a leader in the nation on solar, but those were some of the conclusions that were in that report. But I think it's a good idea. We can revisit some of those endpoints and bring our energy team to talk about the complete picture. This was an item that came out of that January report that we indicated we would start with this committee in 2021. Hence, we're here today as an informational item to really talk about universal waste as a possibility. So we were trying to check that box as the report indicated, and then tell you we'd like to come back in January or March if possible with rule language. So today's info item is directly tied to that report that came through the commission and went to the General Assembly.
Well, this would be major. I mean, this is a major new program, I guess you could say. So if we get more information, as Chair Smith has outlined, maybe we could have something like that in December before we have all the rules in front of us.
Yeah,
we
the,
can work with that.
yeah, so we wouldn't meet again until January, I believe, so we can talk about that coordination. If we need to do something in December, we're amenable to that.
I'm sorry, I was thinking of something else. No, I know it. Yes, I'm sorry. I have another committee in December. How's that?
Understood. Yeah, but we'll take that request back and work with you, Madam Chair, on the timing of that. And if you feel like that can be a part of the rule discussion, or that needs to be in January before these rules came, like in March, we can talk with you about that coordination.
Yeah, let's work through that. Are there any other questions and comments?
I guess.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very good. So I was just wanting to know, like, what percentage of the solar panels are considered hazardous based on your experience? What metals are there of concern? And yeah, those first, and then.
Overall, I don't think that we have an exact figure for how many would be hazardous and how many wouldn't. I think there's, over the timeline, the older ones tend to have lead solder on their frames, so that would make them a hazardous waste. Some of the, depending on the different types, there are ones that have selenium as one of the hazards, chromium, cadmium, differing amounts of metals depending on the manufacturing and the product. So it's hard to define it concisely, unfortunately, because there's so many various types and there are new ones coming out. But I think the new ones coming out and the newer ones have kept that in mind, that, hey, we need to dispose of these someday. So they're trying to evaluate that when they're manufacturing them to make sure that they wouldn't be a hazardous waste at the time of disposal.
Right.
But it's typically metals that would be a part of the solar panel itself.
So have you looked at if making them universal waste, would that discourage developers from pursuing the least of the panels that don't have the toxic metals?
So if it was a universal waste, that's still a subset of hazardous waste. So there's still more requirements on even a universal waste than if it's a non-hazardous or solid waste. So it's far more beneficial to be making a product and determining if it's a non-hazardous waste that has very few requirements and prohibitions attached to it. So we don't think that the universal waste rules would deter manufacturers from trying to develop more non-hazardous solutions, just because there's still requirements associated with universal waste. And one of the biggest ones is the facility that would do the recycling. So it can't just go to a scrap metal facility or any recycling facility. It would still have to go to one that meets these specialized destination facility recycling requirements.
Right. So I've kind of got a similar concern to Commissioner Keen, that, if we put these hazardous panels in a, rural area that's relying on groundwater, these panels, a storm comes through and these panels break. Are we putting those homeowners around those solar facilities at risk?
Understood.
Right.
And yeah, I don't know if I can answer that at this point. I was trying to think of a good analogy of solar panels, and I was trying to think of something, and I don't think I have the right analogy yet, but I keep thinking of like tank farms that hold a product, and we don't regulate those more often. We don't tend to have regulations until something's released to the environment, unfortunately. So I think that we would have to make sure that stuff's not being released to the environment. But yes, I'm hearing what you're saying. Thank you very much for that comment.
Are there any other comments or questions?
One more into my last one. Yvonne, I thank you. So my takeaway then from the last 15 minutes of this would be that there is a gap somewhat. If it is rulemaking or rule language, and Mike did a great job. Thank you. on the overview. But if there's that gap and recognized by Chair Smith that maybe other information is needed to help that gap, to help the League of Municipalities or the Association of County Commissioners or the North Carolina Rural Center, or these people, are they in that gap? And to help them understand if there is rule language, what that rule language will be, and if those stakeholders could be spoke with during this process, just to get some ideas of what they're thinking, because they are looking to permit these large segments of their counties in certain areas. So I just think it's my takeaway would be I would think that rural language would include what we've identified maybe as a gap, in local government being at the table as a stakeholder in this process.
Thank you for the comment. And what I would say is we'll take that back to our team, which includes the energy group, within our department. The January report was part of a stakeholder process before it came to the commission. So I can get the list. I don't have it with me today, but 100 stakeholders were part of that stakeholder group that worked on the different, I think there was 9 components of the legislation that asked the department to evaluate. One of them was financial assurance. There was a universal waste recommendation that became part of the report. But to your point, Commissioner King, there was an active stakeholder process. But we can go back and share that list with you to make sure there was the right representation. We're continuing to engage those stakeholders, but I understand the dialogue, this morning. We'll take that back to our broader team and leadership on the discussion we've had regarding rules.
I think that's very important. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner King. Are there any, Commissioner Arada, I think you've been waiting for a while, and I apologize.
No problem. My one question is whether you could explain a little bit more the connection between increased recycling opportunities and the universal waste characterization.
It's an excellent question. It's because sometimes recycling can be expensive. If there's not enough of the material in if there's not enough of that material out there, the recycling facilities aren't going to spend the money to develop either the infrastructure or the ability to manage these components. So I think the expectation is that if we can lessen some of the regulations, maybe that infrastructure, maybe that money would be spent, maybe because these sites in North Carolina, because it could remain a universal waste in North Carolina, they might say, hey, here's a great opportunity for us. We could keep this material in North Carolina and recycle it under some less stringent requirements. It's kind of a case of if you build it, they will come type thing where it's a hopeful anticipation. We don't know if it actually will result in it. So we want to be able to open up the opportunity to be able to have either new recycling markets or the ability for them to spend money and figure out a way to make it happen.
Was that interest at all expressed during the stakeholder process? Did any of the stakeholders ask or mention this line of thinking that additional recycling opportunities would become profitable enough to?
Yeah, so a couple of the recycling facilities in North Carolina have expressed, they said, well, this might be an opportunity. I think at this point, it's just kind of a thought, like, how will we do this? With so many different various types of solar panels, we need to make sure that it's financially a good opportunity for us. So it's still in the early stages, even for the recycling center. And I think they want to see that these regulations would go through to give them the opportunity to see if they could recycle.
Thank you. And I think I was blocking Commissioner Deerhake's hand when I moved forward.
Yes,
May I ask a question as a visitor to this
yes,
meeting?
Commissioner Deercake.
I have a couple of RECRA-related questions. So in moving from the 40 CFR 261 subpart C category of characteristic waste to a universal part 273 waste, does that require any approval from EPA like a delisting petition might require approval?
So what we would do, that's a great question. North Carolina does have an authorized program under EPA to maintain our state hazardous waste program. So what we would do is develop regulations and rules, and it's kind of a complicated because we need to get buy-in from EPA at the same time to make sure that our program isn't less stringent or isn't that it meets the scope of what we need to do to have it be a universal waste. So it's not a stamp of approval necessarily, but it's them saying that it would be within the bounds of authorization. So at the same time that we're working through this process here in North Carolina, we're also discussing it with EPA to make sure they're on board.
Have other states already received approval?
Yes, so that's also a good point. California and Hawaii have both made solar panels a universal waste. So that helps us definitely to show that EPA is on board for this. There's lots of other state universal wastes that are out there. So the opportunity is definitely there to have this happen as far as having EPA and the federal level approve of us adding it as a universal waste.
Thanks. And my last question, just to clarify, you said there are 9 permitted TSDFs in North Carolina. Are there 9 RECRA permitted subtitle C commercial landfills in North Carolina?
So thank you for asking that question. There are 9 commercial treatment, storage, and disposal facilities that can accept hazardous waste from other sites. They are not, none of them are landfills. So the ones that are in North Carolina can consolidate waste, and some of them do some on-site treatment, but none of them are landfills.
So
Oh,
thank you.
thank you for clarifying
Yeah,
that.
I
'Cause
think the nearest one is South Carolina.
yeah, right, it's Rock Hill,
Yes,
South
and I
Carolina.
apologize for not
Yeah,
understanding your question.
okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much. That was very informative, and we're looking forward to additional information.
Thank you very much.
We're gonna go over our time a little bit, so I have to apologize, Commissioner Deerhake. But we just have a couple of other things to go over. The next agenda item is what is on the EMC meeting agenda items for tomorrow. And I ask that this be added to our agenda going forward so that if some changes have occurred or we need to get additional information about the agenda items that the committee needs to be up to date on, this is where we can find out about it. So the first one is about the groundwater quality standards. And I had asked if Karen Wiggins is here to give us a little update because what happened last time is the groundwater standards were pulled from the agenda and deferred until tomorrow. And there was a good reason for doing so, which I'd like Karen to go over. Thank you, Karen.
I think it's fairly still morning, so good morning. Karen Higgins, I'm in the Division of Water Resources, Water Planning section. Yes, the O2L groundwater standards package will be before the full EMC tomorrow for adoption. We started that full package some time ago. It first came to this committee in the fall of 2019. Since that time, there's been a lot of changes at the federal level. EPA has come out with a PFAS roadmap that they released last month. Yesterday, they have submitted information to their science advisory board, looking at establishing MCLs for PFOA and PFOS. And the indication is that those numbers are going to be a lot lower than the health advisory that came out in 2016. So with this very changing and dynamic environment, We have worked with Chair Bailey, who is also our hearing officer, and recommending that we keep PFOA, PFOS in IMAC land. The division is able to update those in a more timely way than going through a very lengthy rulemaking process. And so Bridget Shelton has been our lead on that project. She's done an outstanding job working through all the comments and working with Chair Bailey, and she's going to give a full presentation tomorrow.
Thank you, Karen. Are there any questions about what you'll see tomorrow? Basically, we went out to public notice with, I forget, over 40 different compounds.
That's right. I think
Yeah.
it was 47.
Right, and so including a standard for PFOA and PFAS, and we decided, based on all the public comments, almost all of which were directed towards those standards we'd proposed, we decided to pull those standards out, but go forward with the remaining over 40 compounds. So that's what you'll see tomorrow, and there's just been a lot of information that's been newly released, so it was really a timely decision to hold off on regulating those compounds. And so they're going to maintain the same as they are now, which is practical quantification limit.
So right now we do have an IMAC for PFOA that's 2,000 parts per trillion. And so we're working internally with our department leadership to kind of figure out what IMAC level is going to be appropriate for PFOA, and then establishing one for PFOS.
Right, but it won't be a standard yet.
That's right.
So it's work in progress.
Yeah.
Thank you. The next one is the request approval of hearing officer's report for the underground storage tank regulations. And that rule set went out and no comments were received. However, Chair Smith reviewed the language in the rules and she had a comment. So I asked Chair Smith if she would just give us a little update on what we're going to see tomorrow.
This is where I confess that I'm a lawyer who spent a lot of time looking at legislation and rules and probably have the soul of an English teacher. And so I tend to look at language really carefully. And I was reading through the rule that was proposed by the division. And what jumped out at me was not their amendment language. I didn't have any question about that. But the amendment changes an existing sentence in the rule that is worded in a very unusual way. It's a rule that adopts a federal rule by reference, but then part of the existing rule goes on to say that federal rule shall be rewritten as follows. And so my question was, well, the EMC can't actually rewrite a federal rule. So do we need to, first of all, do we need this particular sentence at all? But if we need to do that as part of this amendment, is there a way we can word it so that we're not suggesting that we're amending a federal rule, which is not something we can actually do, legally speaking. So the division responded to that and proposed some new language that, again, it looks like it accomplishes what they need to do with the amendment, but eliminates this existing language that is just, I don't even know how old it is. It just looks like it's sort of an artifact from an earlier time, and just cleans that up a little bit. So apologies for a late breaking comment from someone who wasn't asked to comment on it, but that's what it's about.
We certainly appreciate your comment, Chair Smith, and what's being handed out right now is what we'll see tomorrow. And we see that as a technical change, so it doesn't have to go out to public notice again. It's a clarification, which I think sounds like it was a very needed clarification, since I totally can't rewrite federal rules. So does anybody have any comments on that? Thank you. And then the last thing that's going to be on the EMC agenda tomorrow, as far as I know, there weren't any changes or surprises on that one. or new developments. Is that correct, Director Scott?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Bailey. Yes, no changes to the 0832 rules for septic management that will be before the full commission tomorrow. Back to the UST item on the handout, it would be specifically slide 7 would be the language that would be before the commission tomorrow. So you have the whole slide deck, but slide 7 would be the new change that we'll touch on tomorrow. Ruth Strauss with our UST program will present that to the full commission. Thank you.
Thank you for putting that together so quickly. Appreciate it. Well, we're at the end of the agenda. I know Commissioner Deerhake has her committee scheduled right after this, so I'd like to thank Chair Smith for attending and being part of our committee and giving us some good comments on upcoming rulemaking. And welcome Jenny, and I will adjourn the meeting unless somebody else has another comment. Thank you.